Welcome back to our YouTube series on polymers we encounter at almost every corner. We hope you've enjoyed our past videos on gloves, masks, eye protection, sutures, and many more.
So we're going to transition a bit and look at biomaterials as we look at materials that are both biological and synthetic components, so combinations of those two, as well as materials that interact with biological materials. Simultaneously, we're going to look at a topic of great relevance to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And yes, that's right. We're going to look at the role of polymers in the response to the pandemic through vaccine production. So let's go ahead and dive in.
Yeah, so there's several different areas in which polymers, impact and influence the production and efficacy of COVID vaccines. So let's start off with the production part of the vaccines themselves.
Yeah, so common to all of the vaccines is the need to produce the vaccines in completely sterile environments, right? So you want these to be safe, clean, so that you can administer them to patients. And while the mixers and incubators that are used in various components of the processes of making these vaccines are used over and over, the actual parts of these machines and instruments that contact the vaccine materials are actually disposable sterile products.
Yeah, that's right. And for the most part, these mixers and incubators, these are the parts that come in contact with the vaccines. Those are actually made of polymers.
Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at some of these materials, right? And so first up, we have the single-use sterile disposable bags that are used as liners for these mixers and incubators. So these allow for these mixers and incubators to be used many thousands of times. And they not only prevent any single batch of these vaccines from interacting or contaminating the incubator, but also prevent those batches from contaminating any future batches that the companies are going to work on. And so the first set of polymers we're going to look at, the first one is low density polyethylene, which is known as LDPE. And there's also high density polyethylene, which is known as HDPE. So LDPE and HDPE are both thermoplastics. This means that they become softer and moldable at higher temperatures. This allows you to shape them, and then they solidify upon cooling. They're both made from the monomer ethylene, which you can see on the slide above, and they're polymerized to form polyethylene. But there's a difference in the actual structure in terms of the polymer chain. So it turns out that LDPE, which you can see there on the slide, has a much higher degree of branching. So instead of there being many single chains, there are a lot of chains that actually branch out into multiple chains. And the result is that the LDPE materials have a much lower density and are less tightly packed than our HDPE. So this makes these LDPE materials really highly desirable for bags and films. And so much of the material for the sterile disposable mixer and incubator bags are actually made from LDPE. In contrast, you can see the cartoon or schematic there of HDPE, and it has a lot less branching. So it results in this bulk material that is both more dense and more rigid. And that makes HDPE desirable for making connectors or components that provide more rigidity and structure to those bags. So Dominic, the polymers that we've just looked at there are quite useful, but how instrumental are they to the actual process of producing these vaccines?
It's a really good question. It turns out they're really incredibly important. Even though these bags are relatively inexpensive, they are sterile single-use items. They're a really important step for ensuring the vaccine and batches of vaccines don't become contaminated, or the batches don't foul equipment and contaminate future batches. In fact, shortages and supply chain issues with these bags threaten to slow down or halt vaccine production at multiple facilities and companies earlier in the past year or so.
Well, it's incredible how it's such a simple material and really similar to materials that we encounter in our everyday lives are really so important for the production of these vaccines. So let's transition maybe from thinking about the production of the vaccines to the actual components that the vaccines are made of.
Right. So the polymers themselves play a pretty critical part to a lot of the modern vaccines, right? And these polymers are actually PEG type polymers.
Yeah, and so these PEG polymers have really seen a wide range of applications related to human health, right? And so it turns out that these PEG polymers are made from a monomer called ethylene oxide, and you can see that there in that sort of purple color on the left. And it's polymerized to form what we call polyethylene glycol or PEG, and this really produces a very flexible polymer that has a very good solubility in water. And so one of the long-standing, maybe a little more simpler uses of PEG polymers in healthcare is actually as a laxative, where the PEG, when it's ingested, actually encourages water to enter the intestine as an attempt to essentially solubilize that PEG that's there. In contrast, in recent years, pharmaceutical companies have really begun to use polyethylene glycol in more advanced formulations. So they actually take PEGs and conjugate it, or they'll connect it to a protein, so a biologic drug. And these are the things that are starting to be much more common as therapeutics. And this actually allows these drugs or these therapeutics to more effectively evade the host immune system and to avoid digestion by proteases in the bloodstream. So the strategy here, with PEG and the COVID vaccine is fairly similar, except the vaccine uses a special type of fat molecule, which is called a lipid, that actually has a PEG polymer attached to it. And the result is that the lipid shell that surrounds the vaccine and really protects the mRNA that is delivered actually allows that vaccine to evade the host immune system and gives it time to find and fuse with a cell that becomes the recipient of that vaccine.
Yeah, that's really interesting application of PEG. But is there any potential for complications or adverse reactions?
Yeah, in a small number of patients, there have been allergic reactions to the actual PEG polymer. These often are not severe and can be treated if caught quickly. In fact, allergic reactions to other biologic drugs with PEG polymers have been observed in fairly small segments of the population. So typically, PEG polymers are considered to be quite safe. The other complication is that the PEG polymers that are used to help evade the immune system can actually limit the ability of the vaccine to fuse with the cell within the recipient of the vaccine. So this is actually something that the pharmaceutical companies tune quite a bit in terms of modulating how much PEG polymer they have in each preparation, really tightly controlling that to optimize evading the immune system while still allowing these vaccines to actually fuse with the target cell. So, we've discussed, polymers that are important for production of these COVID vaccines. We've looked now at polymers like through these PEGs. There are, a integral component of these vaccines themselves. But one of the things to think about is what about vaccines for the next pandemic, right? For the next issue that's going to come up. So, Dominic, what sort of advances in polymer technologies are in the works for the next generation of vaccines?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. So as we sort of move forward, there are a number of really, exciting technologies being developed involving polymers. One particularly notable one is concept of microneedles. So these are microscopic structures that can be formed from polymers that have they basically pierce the skin and allow administering of the vaccine. So the actual microneedles contain the vaccine on the tips. These typically form a patch, so there's lots of these little needles on an array, and they allow for really easy administration of the vaccine in a way that doesn't involve a traditional needle and syringe. And that kind of can help alleviate some of the concerns with vaccines, especially people who don't like needles.
Yeah, that's really cool. It's exciting to see polymers driving such kind of amazing and really outstanding evolutions in healthcare. It's super cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So that kind of wraps up our episode for today. We hope you've enjoyed our talk looking at the roles of polymers in vaccine technologies.
So in our next episode, we are going to examine how polymers have enabled advances in prosthetics. So we hope you enjoyed this episode and hope you will join us next time.